On the night the river fell quiet and the fireflies stitched silver threads across the water, Harper met a stranger whose calm felt like home, and whose smile asked her to trust what she felt as much as what she knew. The slow river and didn't plan to stop for the night. She meant to push the final 2 hours to the coast. To the cottage she'd rented on a whim after months of city noise and the dull, practical drumbeat of decisions that made sense on spreadsheets but not. In her chest, the GPS voice kept cheerfully promising a straight shot to the highway, but the sky folded into a velvet gray and the drizzle became steady rain. And then there was the Sina weathered wooden plank, hung from iron hooks, swinging lazily over a gravel drive, the Slow River Inn. The name made her exhale in a way she hadn't realized she was holding her breath. Like her ribcage had been carrying a suitcase all day, and someone finally took it from her hand. The inn looked like it had been built by hands that loved quiet details. Big porch, rockers, a line of mason jars on the railing catching the last light. The kind of place that doesn't try hard because it doesn't have to. She pulled in, listening to the rain tick against the windshield, and for a moment she didn't move. The engine hummed like it didn't want to be turned off. But something gentler than logic tapped her shoulder. You're tired. The road will still be there tomorrow. Sense said, keep driving. Sensibility, the soft, inward current she didn't always trust, whispered stay, inside the lobby. A bell chimed with the kind of ring that made you think of pies cooling on windowsills and wool blankets. The air smelled like cedar and orange. Pele, black and white checkerboard floor, ran to a desk with an old brass bell and a ledger so thick it deserved the word tome. A woman in her 60s appeared from a doorway carrying a tray of mugs. Steam trailed up like wisps of ribbon. Evening, the woman said, voice kind, face framed by a silver braid. You look like the rain found you first. It did, Harper said, pushing wet hair behind her ear and feeling suddenly, acutely aware of her own pulse. Do you have a room for the night? We'll always have a room for the kind of traveler who listens to the weather, the woman said, eyes smiling. I'm May. Welcome to the Slow River. The pen in Harper's hand had weight, the good kind, like a promise not to skip. She wrote her name and the date, and when May passed a mug across the desk, the heat seeped into Harper's palms and slowed everything down. Tea with a hint of cinnamon and something floral she couldn't place. She felt it in her shoulders first. The letting go like the rain outside was unhooking tiny knots she'd grown used to ignoring. Breakfast at 8, May said, or whenever your morning decides to begin. She smiled at her own line, like she'd said it 1,000 times, and yet tonight it landed softly, uniquely, as if tailored to Harper's timing. Room 3 is yours. It faces the river. She's quiet tonight, but when she speaks, she's a good listener. Harper laughed before she realized she was laughing. The sound surprised her. Thank you, she said, and meant it more than those 2 words usually allowed. The hallway of the inn held long frames of black and white photographs. The river, in winter wearing ice like lace. A summer's noon when children cannonballed from a rope swing, a fog that turned the water into silt. The carpet was the kind that hugged your footsteps instead of echoing them. Her room welcomed her like a friend, with lamplight the color of warm honey and a quilt that looked handmade by someone patient and unsatisfied with straight lines. She set her bag on the chair and stood by the window. The river was a ribbon of pewter under the dusk. Fireflies had already punched tiny stars into the air between the trees. The kind of scene she'd save as a phone background and then never really see in the hard light of day. But here, it wasn't a capture. It was alive, breathing. She wanted to call someone and say, you wouldn't believe this place. But who? The person she used to tell things to had become a calendar reminder, and then a holiday text, and then a friendly silence. In the city, Harper was good at being sturdy. She could carry a project over the finish line with a smile so steady it soothed the room. She could stay late, send the follow-up, fix the typo before it was noticed. She knew how to be dependable. She knew how to be correct, but standing at that window, with the rain turning to a mist and the river idling, she felt the ache of wanting a softer vocabulary, the one you use for moonlight and pillow. Talk and telling the truth you feel before you can explain it. The knock at her door was small, a fingertip knock. She opened it to May, holding a folded blanket. Even in July, the river can make the nights think it's October, May said, and if you can't sleep, you can sit on the back porch. Nobody minds. A robe and slippers out there. The view does half the dreaming for you. Is it always this quiet? Harper asked. Only when you need it to be, May said. And sometimes, when you don't know you need it. A pause, like an invitation without pressure. There's a little salon tonight, just guests sharing stories in the parlor. If you prefer shadows and thoughts, that's a fine choice. But if you prefer voices and low lamplight, there'll be a pot of cocoa and a plate of shortbread cookies that won't judge your second helping. Harper nearly declined from habit. The city reflex of I'm fine, I'm tired, maybe next time. But the rain made a hush that felt like a hand on her shoulder, warm and persuasive. I'll come down, she heard herself say, for a cookie, maybe 2. May nodded, as if the answer was expected, and patted away with that quiet innkeeper's step. Harper found the robe folded on the shelf, a cloud-soft gray thing with deep pockets, and slipped it on. She left her hair in its unruly braid and padded down the hall. The parlor opened like a favorite chapter. Armchairs that belonged to conversations, a rug with a faded compass rose, and a fireplace whose logs burned low and steady, not dramatic, just present. Around the coffee table sat 3 people, a couple in their 50s arguing softly about whether the sound last night was an owl or a fox, and a man alone with a book closed on his knee. His attention turned toward the fire the way you tend to. Friend May moved through the room like a breeze, refilling cups, placing the cookie plate near Harper with an almost conspiratorial wink. Introductions are gentle here. Names only when they want to be given, she said, and then vanished with hospitality's superpower of disappearing at the perfect moment. Harper sank into a chair. That made her feel held. She reached for a cookie and broke it in half, even though nobody was watching, because it felt true to start small. The cocoa tasted like a kindness done without being asked. She let the warmth travel. The couple resumed their playful debate. The man by the fire smiled to himself, not withdrawing, not intruding, a comfortable presence, like a cathedral hush, or the moment right before a song you love begins. After a while, minutes, or maybe an hour in that elastic parlor time, he turned slightly, enough to make space for conversation, not enough to claim it. I vote owl, he said, eyes glancing toward the couple with that same unhurried smile. But I'm biased. Foxes are my competition. Competition, the woman asked. Intrigued, he nodded. I run before sunrise. Foxes beat me to the trail. We nod in mutual respect, but I can never bring myself to wake the world before they've finished their business. The couple laughed and returned to their comfortable quarrel. The man's gaze drifted to Harper, not a beam, just a warm lamp. First time, he asked, at a place like this? Harper said, or a place like this inside myself. He tilted his head, impressed. Both, maybe. Yes, she said, and then surprised herself by adding, I kept driving past what I was supposed to do. Somehow I landed here. That's how this inn gets most of us, he said. When the road loses the argument with the evening. She took him in. He was a few years older than her, probably late 30s. Soft flannel shirt, sleeves rolled. The kind of hands that knew what to do with rope, and also with a fountain pen. A face that didn't hurry. Dark hair, storm-colored eyes with a light inside, like the sky when it decides to forgive the day. Calm wasn't an absence on him, it was a presence, like he'd made friends with quiet and brought it with him. I'm Harper, she said, because names should be given to people who speak with care. Elias, he answered, as if he understood the ceremony. Welcome. They didn't tumble into the script people use in cities. What do you do? Where do you live? Which side of town has the better coffee? They let the fireplace speak for a while. The couple rose, still amiably negotiating owl versus fox, and said their goodnights. The clock on the mantel ticked with that grandfatherly patience that never criticizes you for being behind. The rain had softened to a whisper. Harper watched the flames settle. She felt the hum in her body change keys. It's oddly easy to be here, she said into the soft room, not to anyone, and yet trusting he'd understand. It is, he said, maybe because there's nothing to win. We're already inside the thing we usually chase, outside. The river turned in its sleep. Harper stood and wandered toward the bookshelf, running her fingers along spines like prayer beads. Poetry, a few field guides, a cookbook with stained pages, good stains, butter and sugar and memory. She pulled a slim novel, because it had a faded blue cover and a name handwritten on the first page in fountain pen script for the borrower who promises to read slowly. She smiled. Elias saw it and nodded, like he recognized a friend's face in a crowd. I'll take it to the porch, Harper said. Seems like a book that needs crickets. The back porch is the inn's cathedral, Elias said. Mine. If I join, I'll be quiet. Please, she said, and the word contained more layers than an invitation usually holds. The porch invited bare feet and secrets. You don't want to keep any more. The river's surface reflected a slice of moon, and a string of fireflies that looked like someone practicing cursive in light. The chairs were deep and forgiving, each with a knitted throw folded over the back. Somewhere, a whip-poor will announced its name, because some nights the world has the decency to be literal. They settled with a space between them, measured not by inches but by trust. She opened the book. He didn't open anything, just breathed like a person who knows breath is a task worth doing well. What brings you here? She asked finally, eyes still on the page, so he could choose to answer at the level he wanted. A sabbatical, he said, from the kind of life that applauds noise. I teach design. I needed to remember shape without the slideshow. She liked the way he said it. No performance, no badge flashing, and the foxes are your early morning colleagues. Exactly, a small smile. You, she paused. Her old instinct was to arrange an answer into smoothness. But the inn made honesty feel like warm soup. I'm trying to remember what my own yes feels like, she said. I've been very good at other people's yes. He nodded slowly, like a bell being rung gently. That's a worthy pilgrimage. They sat while the river loosened. Whatever knots, it knows how to loosen. The book in her lap stayed open to a page she wasn't reading. She could feel the story inside her, though like a tide, you don't have to see to trust. The air smelled like whetstone and sweetgrass. Somewhere in the dark, a branch released a drop that hit the ground with tiny theater. She found herself remembering a summer as a kid when she'd spent a week at a lake, counting the minutes between lightning and thunder to know the storm's distance, not because she was afraid, but because it felt like learning the language of the sky. She wondered when she'd stopped learning languages for their music and started choosing them for their salary. Do you believe in omens? She asked, half a smile on the question to excuse it if it sounded foolish. I believe in attention, he said. Sometimes it wears an omen's coat. She considered that. The firefly scribbled another glowing sentence. The river's voice a hush, a hush, a hush kept time with her breath. She realized that in most rooms, quiet pressed at her like a deadline. Here it held her like a hand. She let her shoulders fall another quarter inch. The kind of tiny shift. That means everything when you're the one living inside it. Tomorrow morning, Elias said, and she felt the sentence before he finished it. There's a bend in the trail where the fog comes low over the water. It's where the foxes end their shift and the herons take over. If you want to see what the world looks like when it's both dreaming and awake, me there. The invitation wasn't a dare. It was an open door that didn't mind being walked past. Sense told her to sleep in, to continue to the coast, to be the kind of traveler who sticks to a plan. Sensibility, the tender, braver part that trusts the compass you keep a little too close to your heart, set an alarm. See, the bend, see what happens when night hands the keys to morning. I'll be there, Harper said, surprised at how easy it was to say. How right? If I can find it, you will, he said, standing, the porch light silvering the edges of him. The trail finds people who intend to walk it. He left her with the river and the book, and she lingered until the night put a shawl around the shoulders of the world. Back in room 3, the quilt welcomed her like a memory she meant to keep. She set the alarm for an hour she didn't usually see unless she'd stayed up working. The number glowed on the screen, not accusing, just real. She clicked the lamp off and lay on her side, facing the window, watching the last firefly notes fade. Sleep came not as a fall, but as a floating, like the river carried her in its quiet palms. In that soft descent, she thought of all the years she'd tried to be correct at the expense of being true. She remembered a version of herself who collected smooth stones because they felt like pocket-sized promises. She pictured a bend in a trail she hadn't seen yet, and a man whose presence played like a song with no sharp edges, a melody you hum unconsciously when you're doing the dishes. Outside, the slow river said what rivers say when they're guarding someone's rest. Hush, hush, you're here. We'll keep watch. And Harper, with both sense and sensibility finally agreeing on one small, bright thing, drifted into the kind of sleep that doesn't erase you, but returns you to yourself gently, like first light taking the night by the hand. The morning, bend the alarm's gentle chime threaded itself into Harper's dream, and for a moment she didn't know if she was still asleep. The quilt's warmth made a persuasive argument to stay where she was, but a part of her, something subtle and awake, reminded her that she'd said yes to seeing the bend in the trail. She opened her eyes to a room brushed in soft blue, that shy preyed on light that makes everything look cleaner, newer. When she swung her legs over the side of the bed, the wooden floor was cool under her bare feet. She took her time dressing, layering a light sweater over a t-shirt, pulling on jeans that felt like an old conversation, then lacing up her sneakers. She poured water from the pitcher into the glass on the nightstand, drinking slowly, like a ceremony. Outside the window, the river wore a thin scarf of mist. The fireflies had gone to bed. May was in the lobby, refilling a basket with apples and small wrapped muffins. Early start, she asked without surprise, as if she already knew where Harper was headed. Elias mentioned a bend in the trail, Harper said. May's eyes warmed. Ah, the heron bend. People come back from there quieter than they left. Sometimes, forever so. She handed Harper a muffin and a paper napkin. Sugar in the pocket. Not for the walk, but for the moment you decide to stay a little longer than you planned. Outside, the gravel crunched under her steps. The air was cool and clean, the kind that brushes your cheeks and says, this day is yours. Elias was leaning against the porch railing, hands in his jacket pockets, looking out at the river. He turned at the sound of her approach, the faintest smile there before his eyes even fully met hers. Morning, he said. His voice was still, in its first cup of coffee, register quiet, unpolished, honest. Morning, she answered, adjusting the strap of her small backpack. Ready? I am, he said, pushing away from the railing. It's not far, but the way the fog holds on it makes the walk feel longer. In a good way. They crossed the lawn and found the start of the trail just beyond a row of poplars. The path was narrow, edged with ferns, the ground damp enough to soften each step, Overhead, branches formed a loose canopy, holding pockets of mist between their leaves. The world felt muted, not silent, but hushed, like a theater before the lights come up. Harper noticed the way Elias walked, not rushed, not dragging, a pace that seemed to match the heartbeat of the morning. She'd walked with people who treated trails like obstacles, something to conquer. Elias moved like the trail was a conversation, and he was listening as much as speaking. "Do you always walk this early?" she asked. "When I'm here," he said. "In the city, I'm more likely to be grading papers or answering emails before sunrise. But here," he breathed in through his nose, slow and deep. "Here, the day asks nicely." She smiled. "That's a rare thing." They reached a small wooden bridge, its planks slick from the mist. The river below moved lazily, a soft silver ribbon curling around a cluster of rocks. Harper paused, leaning on the railing, watching the water catch fragments of light. "Doesn't it feel like time slows here?" she asked. "It does," Elias said. "Or maybe it's just that we stopped sprinting. The clock might still tick the same, but we finally noticed the space between each second." They walked on, the air thickening with the scent of wet pine. The trail curved gently, and then they saw the bend. It wasn't dramatic, no waterfalls, no sweeping canyon views. Just a wide, still pool where the river hesitated before turning, holding the mist like a secret. A heron stood at the far edge, tall and still, its reflection a perfect echo in the glassy water. Harper stopped without meaning to. "Oh," she breathed, the word barely there. "I know," Elias said softly. "You can't rush this part." They stood side by side, not touching, but close enough that she could feel the heat from his sleeve in the cool air. The heron didn't move, its patience a kind of sermon. Somewhere in the distance, a fox barked a short, sharp sound, and then the world settled back into its breathing. "I used to think beauty had to be loud," Harper said, still watching the bird. "Sunsets with orchestras, grand gestures. Lately I've been wondering if it's this quiet, unannounced." Elias nodded. "Loud beauty is easier to notice. Quiet beauty, that's the one that changes you." A breeze lifted the edge of her sweater, carrying with it the faint sweetness of meadowgrass. She turned to look at him, really look his eyes on the heron, his posture unforced, his face in profile against the mist. He looked like someone who belonged to mornings like this, not as a visitor but as a participant. They lingered until the heron finally moved, a slow, deliberate step into the shallows. Then another. It lowered its beak, waited, and in a swift motion caught something invisible from the water. The ripples spread outward, reaching their feet at the edge of the bend. "That's your handoff," Elias said quietly. "Handoff. From night to day," he said. "Once the heron moves, the morning belongs to the sun." And right on cue, a faint blush of light began to seep through the mist. It didn't chase the fog away. It colored it, turning the air around them into pale gold. Harper felt it on her skin first, a hint of warmth. They made their way back along the trail, the world brightening in increments. By the time they reached the bridge, the river had shifted from silver to green, catching pieces of blue from the emerging sky. At the end, May was setting plates of pancakes on a long table by the windows. "Perfect timing," she said, as if she'd been tracking them without looking. "The berries are still warm from the skillet." Harper and Elias sat near the end of the table. The pancakes were as good as the scene outside, blueberries bleeding purple into the golden batter, a dollop of cream melting slowly. They ate in a comfortable quiet, broken only by the scrape of forks and the occasional murmur from other guests. When breakfast was over, Harper carried her plate to the counter. May glanced at her with a small, knowing smile. "The bend is generous, isn't it?" "It is," Harper said. "I hadn't realized how much I needed to see something that unhurried." May's smile deepened, but she said nothing, letting the truth sit where Harper had placed it. Outside, Harper hesitated by her car. The original plan: drive to the coast, check into the cottage, spend the rest of the week reading and walking on the beach, felt suddenly thinner, less certain. The slow river inn wasn't asking her to stay, but it wasn't letting her go without thought either. Elias appeared with a mug of coffee, steam curling in the morning light. "Hitting the road, that was the plan," she said, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. He sipped, eyes on the river. "Plans are sturdy things, but they bend, too." She laughed softly. "Is that your way of saying I should stay?" "No," he said, meeting her gaze. "It's my way of saying you should listen to whatever part of you was awake enough to stop here, in the first place." The choice hung between them like the mist had hung over the bend, quiet, patient, not demanding an answer. She looked past him at the porch, at the chairs where last night's conversations had wound themselves. Into the wood. She thought about the heron, about the fox's bark, about how the air here carried a kind of space she hadn't felt in years. "I might stay one more night," she said finally, the words carrying a lightness she didn't expect. Elias's smile was small, but it reached his eyes. "Then I'll see you at the porch later." She spent the rest of the day in a way she'd forgotten was possible without a checklist. She walked the path behind the inn that led to a small orchard, She sat on a bench by the river and read 3 chapters of the book-covered novel before realizing she'd been watching the water more than the words. She napped under the quilt with the window open, the sound of the river sliding into her dreams. Late afternoon. The porch had that amber glow it gets when the sun tips toward evening. Elias was there, a notebook open on his knee, pen resting in the crease. He looked up when she stepped out, and without needing to say much, they settled into the kind of easy conversation that makes time dissolve. The night stretched out before them, and somewhere in its quiet folds, Harper felt something shift, not a lightning strike, not a dramatic revelation, just the steady turning of a compass needle toward something she hadn't let herself name. Yet and for the first time in a long while, she didn't want to rush the naming. The porch of small repairs. By late afternoon, the sun did what it sometimes does in river towns. It slowed down on purpose, as if the day had earned an extra hour. Shadows lengthened without feeling heavy. The porch boards were warm underfoot, and the screen door gave a soft, familiar sigh each time someone slipped in or out. Harper found herself there again, drawn by the easy hush, the way the inn's heart seemed to beat in those rocking chairs. May moved through the threshold with the calm rhythm of someone who trusts repetition. A tray of lemonade appeared, clinking with ice. A bowl of peaches followed, still wearing the faint fuzz that says July. Elias sat with his notebook open, pen resting across the spine like a quiet bridge. He looked up when she stepped outside, a smile landing in his eyes before it reached his mouth. It felt like being recognized without being studied. The sky held that pale, washed blue you only get after a morning of mist. Out on the river, dragonflies stitched their quick, bright paths just above the surface. Harper slid into the chair beside Elias and set her glass on the rail. They didn't rush in to talk. Instead, they let the small sounds stack gently. Ice shifting, a wren testing a note, a soft wheel of laughter from 2 guests finishing a board game near the far end of the porch. Sensibility, this new growing instinct to lead with feeling instead of argument, told her the space between words mattered just as much as the words themselves. She felt that space settle over them like a light blanket. May says this porch has seen more confessions than the parlor, Elias said at last, half turned toward her. I asked if she meant romantic ones. She said, all kinds. The best ones aren't about what happened yesterday. They're about what someone wants to happen tomorrow. That sounds like May, Harper said, smiling. A sentence that feels like a door opening. She reached for a peach and rolled it in her palm, watching the tiny capillary lines of red near the stem. I used to think confessions had to be grand. Big speeches, tears. Now I'm thinking maybe they're the size of a sentence you can say without rehearsing it. Elias nodded. Content, small repairs, he said. That's what I call them when I'm teaching design. You don't rip a page to make it interesting. You nudge a line, you clear a margin, you let the eye rest. His fingers tapped the edge of his notebook, not fidgeting, more like measuring. Life's the same. Tiny alignments that make the story readable again. I could use a few of those, Harper said. It came out simple, not heavy, a true thing placed on the porch rail to catch a little air. She thought of the long months. She'd lived by other people's urgency, the way her calendar had become a louder voice than the one inside her chest. She didn't need sweeping change. She needed those careful edits, a little more sky in the margins. A line break before the next demand. A silver-haired couple passed them on their way inside. The man wearing a t-shirt that said slow is fast. He grinned and tipped an imaginary hat. River's extra generous tonight, he said, and kept going. Elias watched them disappear, then tilted his head toward the far end of the porch where a shallow wooden box sat beneath a window. It was filled with envelopes, each one sealed and tied with a thin length of twine. May's ledger, he said, not for money, for notes. Guests write something and leave it with her. She mails them in a month. You get your own words back. When you've had time to forget them, Harper felt a quick warmth under her ribs. The idea landed with the satisfying click of a key turning. That's kind, she said. Like time travel with training wheels. Exactly. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small fountain pen, the kind that asks you to slow down and mean it. Want to write one? She thought about deflecting, about saying later, or I need to think first. Sense would have put the decision on a list, saved it for a better moment. Sensibility, still learning to speak up, nudged her now. Yes, she said, I do. May, somehow always nearby without hovering, set 2 blank cards on the small table between them. The paper stocks had weight and a soft tooth. Harper ran her thumb across a corner and breathed. She dated the top and paused, listening for words that didn't come from duty. The river offered a steady hush. The pen warmed to her hand. When she started, the sentence surprised her with how plain it was. A month from now, may I still be choosing the small, honest, yes, even when nobody is looking. She felt something unclenched as she wrote it, like a knot loosening in a necklace inside a drawer. She didn't add more, she didn't need to explain it to herself. She folded the card, tied the twine, and laid it gently in the wooden box. Elias didn't angle his card away like a secret. But he didn't announce it either. His pen moved with that easy confidence of someone who writes often. He tied his bundle, then set it beside hers, a quiet pairing that made the box look briefly like a tiny hope chest. "There," he said, "investment made." He tipped his head toward the river, dividend pending. A soft wind slid along the porch, bringing with it the honeyed smell of cut grass from somewhere downstream. The day tilted toward evening. Harper watched a green canoe drift past the two teenagers moving slow on purpose, paddles barely kissing the water. She remembered being that age, thinking every summer night could stretch forever if you just kept your voice down and didn't. Wake time. She looked at Elias and wondered when exactly adulthood had convinced her that hurrying was an identity instead of a habit. "I used to make maps as a kid," she said, surprising herself. "In the backseat during road trips, I'd draw the turns we took and mark the farms where the cows had patches like continents. I'd name the rivers even though they already had names. I think I loved the feeling of finding shape in the long stretch between towns." "That's design," Elias said. "Wayfinding, not making the world smaller, making it readable." He smiled, the kind that lifts only one corner of the mouth when a memory touches down. "I liked building kites, which is just another kind of map, if you think about it. You're making a diagram for the wind to understand you." May appeared with a small wooden tray full of tuza, tiny hammer, a jar of brass tacks, a tin of wax, a loop of sandpaper. She set it on the table next to a stack of book covers that had loosened at their spines. "Care for a little service project?" she asked, eyes alight. "These old friends have carried a lot of laps. I set them here on evenings when hands want something kind to do." Harper felt the yes form even before the question ended. "Show me," she said. May knelt and guided them a dab of glue along the hinge, a tack pressed in with a decisive push, a firm stroke of wax along the edge so the cloth would lie down and behave. It wasn't fussy, it was respectful. When they finished the first one, Harper ran her palm down the cover and felt a flicker of pride. She hadn't saved anything dramatic. She'd simply kept something going. They worked in companionable quiet. The sandpaper whispered. The tiny hammer made polite consonants against the wood. The porch kept breathing with them. At one point, their hands brushed while both reached for the jar of tacks. They didn't jump or make a joke of it. They just let the contact registered quick, warm acknowledgement that two currents had met for a second and continued on. Harper felt the awareness in the simplest place, low behind the ribs, a settling instead of a spark. This wasn't drama. It was fit. Thunder spoke once, very far off, the way mountains clear their throat. A faint new scent joined the air rain, warming up its lines backstage. Guests lifted their faces a little, like sunflowers finding light. May set a woven basket of rolled candles on the ledge near the door. "Just in case," she said. "The river towns like to practice their power outages. We take it as rehearsal for patience." The first drops came wide and slow, a scatter pattern on the porch steps, and then the curtain drew in earnest. Rain doesn't hurry, but it can insist, and this one insisted. The roof drummed, the lawn darkened to a deep, grateful green. The screen door breathed in and out as a few people slipped inside. Harper and Elias stayed where they were, the edge of the storm's breath cool on their ankles. She loved the way heavy rain temporarily rewrites a place. Edges blur, rivers fatten. Time pulls up a chair and puts its boots on the rail. "Tell me something true from before you were 20. Elias said, voice pitched low. "A request, not a challenge, something you don't put on forms." She let the rain fill the first silence so she could choose honestly. "There was a willow near my middle school," she said. "At the back of the baseball field, the kind with the low branch you could sit on like a swing made by a poet. I used to go there after practice and read for 15 minutes before I walked home. I never told anyone because it felt like a password. It wasn't about hiding. It was about keeping the place from getting used up by too many footprints." He nodded, receiving it without commentary. "I made a paper boat fleet and raced them in the gutter during a storm like this," he said after a moment. "All of them except one sank or flipped. The last one made it to the storm drain and vanished. I thought about it for years. Not that it was gone, but that it had places to go I didn't know how to imagine yet." "That's a good kind of missing," Harper said, smiling. "The kind that adds instead of The lights in the parlor flickered once, twice, and then settled into a steady glow. A breeze that smelled like penny and stone pushed a thin strand of hair across Harper's cheek. Without thinking, Elias reached up and tucked it behind her ear, his fingers careful, casual, like he'd done it 100 times in 100 other lives. They both felt the moment gather a little weight and then set it down gently, agreeing, without saying so, to let this pace be the whole point. They talked around the edges of the lives they'd lived, jobs, cities, favorite bakeries found and lost. Harper told him about the time she'd fixed a jammed office printer during a crisis and became the printer whisperer for a year, a nickname that somehow said more about misaligned expectations than technical skill. Elias admitted he had a folder in his desk labeled letters I didn't send. Ideas to deans and op-eds to nobody that he wrote fully and then filed away because he'd needed the expression more than the argument. They laughed, the kind of laughter that doesn't jolt the nervous system, the kind that leaves the shoulders as it arrived, easy. The rain eased to a soft conversations between drops rhythm. Fireflies turned on early, maybe fooled by the dimly lit 3 candles, even though the power stayed steady, just to honor the old ways. The wicks took flame like they'd been waiting. All day the porch gathered their light and gave it back double. Harper felt the slow joy of a day that had asked very little of her and returned much more. She reached for her glass. Elias at the same moment reached for his, and their knuckles knocked softly. She liked it. The touch didn't feel like a cliff or a test. It felt like alignment. Later, when the rain had folded itself into the trees and the river, a soft bell rang from inside May's signal that Coco had replaced lemonade and a piano would be playing soon if anyone wanted to hum along. A retired teacher with easy hands sat at the old upright near the hearth and began to offer the kind of songs that know how to live in a room without taking it over. Standards, lullabies that grown-ups pretend are for children, the sturdy chords of American hymns that don't preach as much as they bless. People drifted in, carrying the smell of wet grass and porch wood, and the inn gathered itself the way a good quilt does around a winter foot. Harper and Elias moved to the doorway, watching the small congregation of strangers share something without needing to touch names. The retired teacher looked up between songs and said, "Requests." As gently as you might ask, "Are you thirsty?" Someone offered Moon River like a coin placed on the counter of a diner you've loved since you were 16. The first note settled into the room and changed it, not because the song is rare, but because it knows how to land softly wherever it goes. Harper felt a sweet ache under her breastbone. Okay, she thought. Okay, world. I remember this part. A little later, May returned to the porch holding a shallow basket of envelopes, a different collection than the month-later ledger. These ones were addressed by hand but not yet stamped. Tonight's mail, she said, a tradition. If you write to somebody you've been meaning to, we'll post it in the morning. No return address necessary if you don't want it. Half the time, folks address them to themselves. I don't judge. Mail is mail. Harper took an envelope and a card without thinking about it too much. She didn't have a tidy list of people to write. She didn't need one. The pen hovered, and then she wrote to the version of herself who used to sit on that willow branch, keeping a secret. 15 minutes for reading. You were not wasting time, she wrote. You were practicing being inside your life without asking permission. She signed it with today's date and her first name only. Like a promise made to a friend in a train station. Elias wrote too, brow soft, not furrowed. He slipped his card into an envelope and sealed it with the heel of his palm. For a second, it looked like he might hand it to her, and then he tucked it into May's basket instead. Not coy, just honoring the route it was meant to take. May approved with that constellation of laugh lines near her eyes that served as punctuation in this house. As night took the top half of the trees, the river changed keys again. The water near the bank dimmed to pewter. A small chorus of frogs began the shift work they do so well. Across the field, the lights in the barn that the inn used for community dinners blinked on 5 warm squares that made a constellation. Nobody had ever named, but everybody understood. Elias leaned his shoulder against the post near Harper's chair and watched the windows with her. They didn't speak for a while. It was enough to share a field of view. Do you ever worry you're being foolish? Harper asked finally, the question as much to herself as to him. Staying, slowing down, letting a day like this count more than a dozen efficient ones. Sure, he said, and then I remember how many foolish things I've tried for the wrong reasons and how gently they failed me. If I'm going to be foolish, I'd rather try it for the right reasons. Like showing up where I can hear my life, think. She breathed out a quiet laugh. That sounds like something I could write on the inside of a closet door and see every morning. Write it, he said. Closet doors need more poems. A moth tested the flame of one of the candles and then changed its mind. The piano, inside, slipped into a waltz. 2 of the older guests moved 3 small kitchen steps on the rug by the hearth, counting softly, smiling without being precious about it. Harper and Elias watched through the doorway, both grinning a little. The way you do when you're witnesses to a human moment that owes you nothing and still gives you everything. The music ended without applause. The teacher cracked his knuckles, apologized for the bad habit, and began Autumn Leaves, even though summer was insisting itself all over the yard. Walk, Elias asked. Just to the edge of the lawn. They ran. The grass held the day's rain in its tips and laced it across their ankles. Fireflies approved with modest gestures. At the far edge, where the lawn gave itself back to the riverbank, a rope swing hung from a branch. The seat, a worn plank smoothed by 1,000 careful thighs. Nobody else was there. The swing moved an inch in the small breeze, asking nothing, offering itself as a hinge between gravity and let go. Harper set a hand to the rope, felt the tarred roughness, the honest fibers. They stood there a moment, looking at the water in its night clothes. My students think inspiration is a lightning bolt, Elias said, quiet, but most of the time it's a hinge. You oil it. You test it, you go back inside. Then one day, you realize the door swings easy. Small repairs, Harper said, smiling. I'm going to be thinking about hinges for a while. They headed back to the porch slowly, the sort of pace that lets the night explain itself in 100 minor keys. Near the steps, Harper paused. Thank you, she said. She didn't specify for what: the bend, the peaches, the porch repairs. The way he hadn't hurried anything that didn't want to be rushed. She meant all of it. He understood it that way, too. His nod wasn't the polite kind. It was the kind you give when gratitude lands between two people and calls itself furniture. Upstairs, room 3 had its lamplight ready. The quilt turned down. The window cracked just enough to let the river's lullaby earn its keep. Harper set her phone face down on the dresser. A small act that felt like placing a stone to mark a trail. She brushed her teeth, pulled on the soft robe, and stood at the window long enough to watch a bat scribble. A quick arc over the water, like a punctuation mark the night needed. In the chair by the window, the blue-covered novel waited. She opened to the ribbons place and read a page. Then she closed it again, not because the story failed her, but because the one outside the glass felt more urgent in the gentlest way. She thought about the envelope that would arrive in a month with her own handwriting inside. She pictured opening it on some Tuesday when the elevator stalled, or the inbox swelled, or the city roughhoused her into cursing at nothing in particular. She pictured reading that single sentence, use the small, honest yes and, feeling the floor tilt back into level. The thought made her smile. It was a future kindness already on its way. She tucked that feeling beneath the quilt like a heat pack. Before she turned off the lamp, she picked up the second blank card May had left on the tray with the tools. She hadn't noticed it earlier, but there it was, different paper, faint, flecks of color, like moth wings. No envelope, just space, enough for 5 lines. May's tiny handwriting curled at the top. List 5 things that made you breathe easier today. Harper didn't have to reach for them. They came, clear as river. Stones, the heron's patience, warm peaches, the sound a brass tack makes when it sets, a piano waltz, a rope swing moving an inch. Asking nothing, she set the card on the nightstand and felt her lungs expand as if on command. At some hour that belongs. 2 moths and bakers. A light drizzle returned and wrote its soft script on the roof. Harper turned on her side and let the day gather under her, like a cedar chest supports quilts. She wasn't in a rush to name whatever was unfolding with Elias. She didn't need a plan for how it would travel when she left the inn. For once, her sense and her sensibility weren't at odds. Sense said, "You're safe." Sensibility said, "You're seen." Both were right, and it felt like the rare natural phenomenon of 2 winds meeting and warming each other instead of tearing the air. When sleep began to tug, she thought briefly of the willow at the ball field, of the girl who had known how to keep a sacred 15 minutes without advertising it. She realized she was becoming, again, the kind of person who doesn't ask permission to be soft. The river, as if nodding from below the window, shifted its cadence and whispered the well-practiced lull that cottages and inns and tired travelers have trusted for centuries. Hush now, we've got you. She sank into it, not the drop-through, a trapdoor, but the slow lowering of a stage at the end of a play you loved. Lights dimming in a way that leaves the story awake inside you. Downstairs, May blew out the 3 porch candles one by one, pinching each wick between moistened fingers and releasing the faint ribbon of smoke that smells like rain, saying thank you. She closed the ledger box, tied a loose bow, and set the envelopes for Morning Post in a neat, intentional stack. In room 3, Harper's breath joined the river's, 2 steady lines on the same staff. And somewhere, under the roof's slope, in a room turned tender by years of winter coats and summer fans, a hinge on an old door, one that the inn had oiled with patience, again and again swung quietly. Icily a reminder that small repairs, done with love, let whole houses rest. Morning would come with its soft questions and its delicate promises. For now, the night held everything in a safe, amber keeping. The bend with its heron, the porch with its mended spines, the envelope en route to a future Tuesday, the memory of a willow seat that taught a girl that time can be hers. And just there, inside that patient keeping, a tender fact glowed without urgency. 2 lives had begun to tune to the same key, not loudly, not fast, but with the steady, humane logic of things that are finally right. Harper, wrapped in the slow river's quiet, slept like someone who had returned to a room she'd forgotten she owned, and the inn, which has always loved a good reunion, hummed along in the dark. Breakfasts you don't rush. Harper woke to the scent of something warm and sweet moving through the floorboards. For a moment, she didn't remember where she was, only that her body felt oddly unarmored, like she'd slept without clenching her fists inside the sheets. Then the quilt's weight, the river's hush, and the slant of early light across the foot of the bed returned to her all at once. The slow river in the porch, Elias de Heronbend. She lingered a few minutes, letting the room introduce itself again in the morning colors. The window was still cracked open from last night. Cool air floated in with the faint metallic note of dew. She could hear clinking from downstairs, that gentle, happy chaos of plates being stacked, coffee poured, chairs nudged into place. Down in the dining room. Breakfast was an unhurried affair. May had set long platters of scrambled eggs dusted with herbs, baskets of biscuits that seemed to steam even as they cooled, and small jars of her own strawberry preserves, the kind where the fruit still looks like itself. There was no menu, no rush to order, just the quiet understanding that you could take what you liked and sit where the light felt good. Elias was already there, seated near the corner window where the sun just grazed the edge of the table. He had a mug in front of him and one elbow resting loosely on the wood. He looked up when she entered, and for some reason, the way his eyes lit like it was both a recognition and a welcome made something in her chest catch before releasing. "Morning," he said, and it wasn't filler. "Morning," she returned, feeling the word land between them with a surprising amount of substance. May appeared beside her with a coffee pot in one hand, tea kettle in the other. "Coffee or tea?" she asked. "Coffee, please," Harper said. The mug was heavy in her hands in a satisfying way, as if it wanted to be held, not just used. She filled her plate with a small biscuit, a few spoonfuls of eggs, and against her usual breakfast habits, a spoonful of preserves. She took the seat opposite Elias. For a few moments, they didn't talk, letting the light and the food do their work. When conversation did come, it came without any need for introductions. "I fixed another book spine this morning," Elias said. "May says the little library here is basically a collection of well-traveled bones. Every guest leaves their fingerprints in the margins." "I like that," Harper said. "It means the books are lived in." She thought for a moment, then added, "I think I'm starting to feel that way here." The corner of his mouth lifted, like a spine that's been repaired a few times, but still holds. She nodded, smiling into her coffee. "Exactly." The light shifted as clouds moved lazily past the sun, dappling the table with soft shadow. Other guests came and went, exchanging nods and brief good mornings. May carried a tray to the far side of the room where two older women were playing a quiet game of cards before heading out for the day. Harper and Elias sat for a while longer than breakfast strictly required, sipping coffee and occasionally exchanging thoughts like postcards, short, meaningful enough to let the other person know where you were. At one point, Elias glanced toward the back porch. "There's a path past the orchard," he said, "leads to a small clearing where the wildflowers think they own the place. You want to see it before the sun gets too high." Harper hesitated, not because she didn't want to go, but because she felt that strange, delicious pause where you're saying yes to something that might matter more than the thing itself. "Yes," she said, "let's go." The orchard was still damp from last night's rain, the grass folding slightly under their shoes. Apples, not yet ripe, dotted the branches like small promises. They walked between the rows, their shoulders occasionally lining up close enough for the air between them to shift. The clearing appeared suddenly, like a page turning to a vivid illustration. A wide patch of meadow spread out, thick with daisies, black-eyed, Susans, and purple coneflowers. Bees floated from bloom to bloom with the unhurried confidence of creatures who've never been late to anything in their lives. Harper stood still, just taking it in. "It's wild, but not messy," she said finally. Elias glanced at her, then back to the flowers. "Nature's good at that balance. I try to teach it in design, but paper and ink can only get you so close." They wandered slowly through the clearing, careful where they stepped. Harper crouched to trace a fingertip along the edge of a daisy petal, noticing the way the white seemed to glow against the deeper green. "Do you ever sketch out here?" she asked. "Sometimes," he said, "but mostly, I just stand still. Let the place draw itself into me." There was a quiet in the clearing that was different from the porch or the riverbank. It wasn't the hush of rest. It was the hush of something growing exactly as it was meant to, without an audience. Harper felt her own breathing fall into sync with it. When they finally made their way back to the inn, May was on the porch with 2 glasses of iced tea, as if she'd known where they'd been and what they'd need. "Wildflower clearing?" she asked, handing Harper a glass. "Yes," Harper said, smiling. May nodded, her braid catching a streak of sun. "That place will tell you the truth if you let it." Harper sipped her tea, the glass cold against her palm, and thought not for the first time that she was beginning to understand why some people arrive at the slow river inn for one night and find themselves still there a week later. The lantern walk the day had unspooled itself in the quiet way that good days sometimes do, without any single event demanding to be the headline. Afternoon light slanted across the orchard, the smell of grass clippings drifted in from somewhere upstream, and the inn's porch filled and emptied in cycles like the tide. Harper had read a few pages of the blue-covered novel in the shade, dozed in the rocker for 10 minutes without meaning to, and lingered through an iced tea with May on the steps. By the time the sun began leaning into the horizon, the air carried that delicate shift from warmth to cool, like someone had just turned the pillow over to the fresh side. May appeared on the porch with a bundle of paper lanterns, the kind that glowed soft instead of bright, their colors muted and warm. "Lantern walk tonight," she said, her voice lilting like a secret being let out. "We string them along the lower trail by the river. Walk as far as you like. The fireflies keep company." Harper set her book aside. "That sounds." She searched for a word that wasn't cliché. "Like something my bones might remember." May smiled knowingly. "That's exactly the point." Elias emerged from the inn's front door just then, hands in his pockets, his shirt sleeves rolled halfway up his forearms. He glanced at the lanterns, then at Harper. "Going to the walk?" "I think so," she said. "Good," he replied, simply, as if it were a decision they had made together. The lantern trail began where the porch steps met the grass. A few other guests gathered, some in pairs, some alone, each carrying a lit lantern by its curved bamboo handle. The glow wasn't meant to light the way so much as to make you aware of the fact that you were walking. Harper's lantern was a soft amber. Elias's glowed the faint blush of coral. They fell into step without needing to coordinate. The grass underfoot shifted to the fine grid of the river path, its curve leading them into a world that seemed designed entirely for walking. Slowly, lanterns dotted the trail ahead like low constellations, their colors swaying with each step of the people carrying them. For a while, they didn't speak, letting the evening do the talking. The river moved alongside them, silvering in the thin light. Above, the first stars began to push through the darkening blue. Fireflies stitched their erratic embroidery across the meadow edges, sometimes so close Harper could almost cup them. "I used to think walks like this were for people who didn't have much to say," she murmured after a while. "Now I think, maybe they're for people who want the air to carry part of the conversation." Elias's glance was brief but warm. "Exactly. The best talks don't start at the mouth. They start in the pace of your steps." They rounded a bend where the trees leaned in, their branches meeting above, like a shy archway. The lantern light made shadows climb the trunks in gentle waves. Harper could hear the river more clearly here, the current quickening as it slid. Over a narrow bed of stones, she slowed, letting the sound wash over her. "My grandmother had a creek behind her house," she said, "not much wider than a hallway. But I'd sit there for hours when I visited, tossing pebbles, trying to guess where they'd land. She used to bring me lemonade in a mason jar and tell me the water would remember me if I came back often enough." Elias smiled. "Did you test it?" "I did," Harper said, "and the water at least in my head always seemed to flow a little differently when I was there." They walked a few more lantern lengths in silence, both smiling faintly at the image. Somewhere ahead, the murmur of low voices drifted back from another pair of walkers. Elias gently steered them toward a side spur of the path where fewer lanterns hung. The light here came mostly from the fireflies and the moon's faint spill over the treetops. The spur ended in a small wooden dock that reached a few feet into the river. No one else was there. A single lantern hung from a hook on one post, its glow reflecting on the rippled surface like an underwater sun. Harper stepped onto the dock, feeling the boards shift slightly under her weight. "It smells like rain," she said softly. "It might come late tonight," Elias replied. "The kind you hear in your dreams but don't wake up for." They stood, side by side, looking down at the water. Small fish flickered below, quick as blinks. The lantern light made their scales flash in brief silver arcs. Harper leaned on the railing, her elbow brushing his forearm. This time, neither of them shifted away. "I'm not sure I've ever been this unrushed," she admitted, "even on vacations. I've got an itinerary. Here, I can barely remember what day it is." "That's the point," Elias said, his voice steady. "Some places give you what you ask for. This place gives you what you forgot to ask for." She let his words settle. They felt true in that deep, unshowy way truth sometimes does, like a stone finding the bottom of the river without making a splash. A gentle breeze lifted her hair across her cheek. Elias reached out without hesitation, brushing the strand back behind her ear, just as he had the night before. His fingers lingered for the briefest moment, the touch light but deliberate. Before he lowered his hand again, Harper looked out at the water, her pulse slower but somehow stronger. "You're careful," she said, her tone not accusing, but observant. He met her gaze. "I've learned to be," he said simply. "Careful doesn't mean afraid. It means I notice." She nodded, feeling the weight and warmth of the distinction. They stayed on the dock until the lantern's flame dipped low, the wick folding in on itself. Elias lifted it from the hook, shielding it with his palm, ready to head back. "Not quite," Harper said. "Let's take the long way." The long way wound them along a path even closer to the river. Here, the lanterns were spaced farther apart, making the dark between them richer, more intimate. Their conversation took on the rhythm of the path pausing for a stone. Resuming, at the crest of a small rise, Harper told him about the time she got lost in Venice, not the romantic kind of lost, but the slightly panicked version where every alley seemed to loop back on itself. Elias shared the story of the year he lived in a one-room cabin on a friend's property, learning how to heat with wood and measure his days by the light on the walls. Somewhere in the middle of these small confessions, the air between them seemed to shift again, less like two guests walking, and more like two people sharing a thread they didn't want to drop. When they reached the porch again, most of the lanterns had been brought in. May sat by the steps, a small basket of cookies on her lap. "You missed the last of the cocoa," she said, but the cookies stayed warm. Elias took two, handing one to Harper without looking, as if the motion was already familiar. They stood for a moment under the porch light, the air still holding the cool of the river. "Good walk," Elias said. "Better company," Harper answered. Before she could second-guess herself, they lingered another minute, the space between them now full of quiet things neither felt the need to name. Then, with a mutual nod that didn't feel like goodbye so much as until later, they stepped inside. Up. In room 3, Harper set her lantern on the dresser. Its glass was warm in her hand, the smell of charred wick, faint but comforting. She thought about the dock, about the way Elias had brushed her hair back as though it were the most natural thing in the world. She thought about his voice, not afraid in, the way it had settled into hertz like a low note that didn't need to resolve. The river's voice slipped in through the cracked window, steady and low, as she slid beneath the quilt. She closed her eyes with the quiet conviction that some walks don't end when your feet stop moving. When the river keeps a secret. Morning arrived with a faint percussion of rain on the roof, a light, steady tapping that felt less like a storm, and more like the sky clearing its throat. Harper lay still beneath the quilt, letting the sound find its way into her breathing. Rain had a way of slowing even the thoughts that usually rose like startled birds when she woke. She turned on her side. The window cracked just enough to let in the smell of wet leaves and distant wood smoke. She didn't know how long she stayed like that, but when she finally rose, the rain had softened to a mist that hung low over the orchard. The grass glistened, each blade crowned with its own jeweled bead of water. Downstairs, the dining room was quieter than usual, most guests still in their rooms, reluctant to leave warm beds. May stood behind the counter, slicing pears into thin crescents. Slow start today, May said, without looking up from her work. "Seems like the weather's conspiring with the beds to keep everyone put." Harper replied, "Not a bad conspiracy." May's knife moved in clean arcs, the slices piling neatly on the plate. Some days call for more stillness than others. The river knows it, so does the rain. Harper poured coffee into a heavy mug and sat at the far window. Outside, the path to the orchard looked softer, edges blurred by the mist. I was on her second sip when Elias appeared, one hand absently rubbing the back of his neck, the other holding a leather-bound sketchbook. His hair was slightly damp, like he'd stepped outside without caring about the drizzle. "Morning," he said, his voice lower than usual. "Morning, warm, double quotes morning." Harper returned, feeling the sound of it in her chest more than her throat. Set his sketchbook on the table between them, flipping it open to a page that held a charcoal drawing of the heron bend. The lines were clean but not rigid, the water rendered in quick, fluid strokes, as if he'd wanted to catch it before it moved on. "You drew this?" she asked, running her fingertips lightly over the paper's edge. "This morning," he said. "The bend looks different in the rain. More private." Harper studied the drawing. "It feels like you caught the moment just before it wanted to be left alone." Elias smiled faintly. "That's when I like to stop, before the place realizes it's being observed." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, Harper nursing her coffee, Elias sketching something new in the margin of another page, something she couldn't see clearly from her angle. The rain outside slowed to an almost imperceptible drift. By midday, the mist had lifted, replaced by a gentle brightness that didn't quite commit to sun. May mentioned that the riverbank would be quiet. Today no canoe rentals, no pick, the sound of water, and whatever birds didn't mind the damp. Harper found herself saying yes before Elias even asked if she wanted to walk down. The path to the river was slick in places, the earth still holding the night's moisture. Their steps made a muted rhythm, the occasional snap of a twig filling in the rests. The air was cooler here, the kind that made you keep your hands in your pockets for warmth rather than out of habit. They reached a low stretch, where the bank dipped into a small cove. The water here was calmer than the main current, its surface a shifting mirror of pale sky and willow branches. Elias stepped onto a flat rock near the edge and looked out over the water. Harper stayed just behind him, close enough to see the small ripples from where his boot grazed the surface. "It's quieter than I expected," she said. "That's because the river's keeping a secret today," he replied. She tilted her head. "And you can tell," he shrugged. You start to notice when a place holds something back. The bend has it too, sometimes, a pocket of stillness that doesn't want to be disturbed. They stood there a while, neither asking the other. To explain further, Harper crouched and touched the water's surface with the tips of her fingers. It was cooler than she'd imagined, sending a brief shiver through her hand. When she pulled it back, droplets clung to her skin like small glass beads. Elias glanced. At her hand, you ever skip stones? Not well, she admitted. He picked up a flat pebble from the bank, weighed it in his palm, then flicked his wrist in a quick, practiced motion. The stone skated across the surface 3 times before, vanishing with a quiet plunk. He offered another to her. She mimicked his grip and throw, but the pebble made a single splash and sank without ceremony. Needs more finesse, he said, smiling. I think the river prefers my way, she replied, feigning seriousness. They tried a few more, her results improving only slightly. Each attempt ended with their laughter echoing softly off the opposite bank, the sound folding neatly into the water's own voice. Eventually, they settled on a large sun-bleached log just beyond the bank, its surface smooth from years of weather. The air carried the faint scent of wet earth and riverweed. Elias rested his elbows on his knees, looking out at the slow drift of the current. Do you ever feel, he began, like the life you built ritually, intentionally turned into something you have to keep tending, even when you're not sure you want it anymore? Harper turned the question over in her mind before answering. Yes, I've built whole schedules around things I stopped wanting years ago. But they keep running, and I keep up because stopping feels like explaining yourself to everyone who wasn't even paying attention in the first place. Elias nodded, his gaze still on the water. That's why I take sabbaticals. It's my way of letting go without burning the whole thing down. She studied the set of his jaw, the quiet thoughtfulness in his profile. And does it work? Sometimes, he said. Other times, I come back knowing something has to change. And then I have to decide whether I'm brave enough to change it. The honesty in his voice pulled something in her a little closer. She realized she'd been leaning toward him without noticing. The walk back to the inn was slower. They didn't fill the space with conversation, but the silence between them felt different now, less like absence, more like an understanding. On the porch, May was arranging jars of fresh flowers along the railing, small bouquets of wildflowers from the clearing Harper had visited the day before. She glanced up, her eyes flicking between the two of them for a fraction of a second longer than usual, as if she'd noticed the shift too. Dinner's at 7, she said, tying a length of twine around one of the jars. But you'll want to be on the porch around 6:30, Sky's putting on a show tonight. When the time came, Harper found Elias already seated in one of the rocking chairs, a blanket folded on his lap. The horizon was painted in broad strokes of gold and coral, the kind of light that makes you believe in benevolence. She took the chair next to his, and without asking, he offered her half the blanket. They watched the sky change together, the colors bleeding slowly into deeper shades. The air cooled as the sun dropped, and somewhere across the river, a loon called once before falling silent. May was right, Harper said. She usually is, Elias replied. As the first stars appeared, a single lantern was lit on the porch table between them. Its warm circle of light caught the curve of Elias's jaw, the faint crease at the corner of his mouth when he smiled. Harper found herself memorizing it without meaning to. The moment felt balanced on a quiet edge, nothing pressing them forward, nothing pulling them back. Just the soft awareness that some evenings hold more than they reveal. Later, in her room, Harper sat at the small writing desk by the window. She took out the card May had given her on her first night, the one meant for a message to her future self, and turned it over in her hands. She hadn't decided what to write until now. Asterisk, asterisk, she uncapped the pen and began, the words coming steady and sure. Remember the dock, remember the way the air felt before you spoke. Remember that careful isn't afraid. When she was done, she set the card beside the lamp and looked out at the river. The water reflected a thin ribbon of moonlight, winding away into the dark like a path you could follow if you knew how to listen. The porch. After dark, the rain that had threatened earlier in the week finally came, just after dinner, a patient, steady curtain that turned the porch into the inn's most coveted seat. The guests drifted out with mugs of tea and cocoa, wrapped in blankets that smelled faintly of cedar. The lanterns lit in a neat row along the railing, threw their light in small, overlapping halos, soft enough not to compete with the darkness. Beyond, Harper found Elias near the far corner, where the rocking chairs faced both the river and the orchard. He was sitting with one ankle crossed over his knee, a mug cradled in both hands, his gaze fixed on the blurred shimmer of rain hitting the river's surface. He glanced up as she approached, a slow smile forming that seemed to belong only to her. "You're late," he said lightly, shifting the blanket on the chair beside him in invitation. "I had to help May carry in the desserts before the rain found them," Harper replied, settling into the chair. She draped the offered blanket across her lap, the shared warmth immediate and grounding. The porch's rhythm was different tonight. Conversations were lower, as if the rain had its own voice and guests were reluctant to speak over it. Somewhere, near the center, a group played cards, their laughter rising and fading in gentle waves. The air smelled of cinnamon and wet wood. For a while, Harper and Elias just listened to the rain. It was the kind of quiet that didn't ask for filling, the kind that let two people share space without performance. Then, softly, as though continuing a thought they'd started days ago, Elias said, "I've been thinking about your willow." "My willow, the one behind your school, the branch you used as a swing," he clarified. "I think places like that, they shape us more than we admit. They teach us what kind of spaces we trust." Harper's hands curled around her mug, absorbing the heat. "I suppose that's true. That willow was the first place I kept just for myself. I didn't have to share it, or explain it, or make it useful to anyone else. I could just be there." Elias nodded slowly. "For me, it was an attic in my grandmother's house. Low ceiling, dusty windows, piles of old furniture nobody wanted. It was the only place where no one expected me to be anything. I'd sit there for hours with a sketch pad, pretending I was a cartographer mapping out imaginary islands." She smiled at the image. "So you've been drawing for a long time." "Since before I knew why," he said. "And maybe that's still true. I draw because it's how I listen to the world. Like your willow, it's not about making something to show anyone. It's about having a place to put the kind of quiet you don't want to lose." They both sipped their drinks, letting the porch light flicker over the space between them. After a few minutes, Harper asked, "Have you ever told anyone about that attic before?" Elias thought for a moment. "Not in detail. It's funny, sometimes it's easier to talk about something like that with someone you haven't known forever. No history, no baggage." "I know what you mean," Harper said, her voice softer. "Now, sometimes the people closest to you think they already know all your stories. They stop asking." The rain thickened briefly, drumming harder on the roof. Harper found herself watching the way Elias's thumb traced the rim of his mug, slow and absent-minded, as though keeping time with the storm. "Tell me something you've never told anyone," he said, not as a challenge, but as an offering. Harper's first instinct was to deflect, to say she'd need time to think. But something about the night, the rain, the soft lantern light, the easy way Elias met her eyes made her want to answer. "When I was in my 20s, she began. I planned a trip to Paris. I had the flights booked, the hotel, everything. And a week before I was supposed to leave, I canceled. I told people it was because of work, but the truth was, I got scared. Not of the city, of being alone in a place where no one knew me. I'd traveled before, but always with someone. The idea of navigating a whole week solo felt like too much." Elias didn't rush to fill the pause that followed. He let the rain speak for a few moments before saying, "And now," she took a breath. "Now I wish I'd gone. I think I could have handled it. Maybe I even needed it." He tilted his head, considering maybe that's why you stopped here. The inn is a kind of solo Paris. Different language, but same idea. You're somewhere that doesn't know you, and you're learning you can belong anyway. Harper smiled faintly, feeling both seen and gently challenged. Maybe so. The card game at the other end of the porch broke into laughter. Someone called out a playful protest about cheating, and May's voice floated from the doorway, telling them to keep it friendly. The rain eased again, back to its earlier, steady murmur. Elias shifted in his chair, angling toward Harper a little more. "Your turn," she said, realizing she wanted to hear something from him just as personal. He nodded, taking a moment. "When I was younger, I used to think I'd have everything figured out by 40. The kind of house I'd live in, the work I'd be doing, maybe even a family. And now I'm here, past that mark, and I've realized I'm still choosing, still experimenting." "Does that scare you?" "Some days," he admitted, "but mostly it feels like permission, like the story doesn't have to be finished just because you've written a lot of chapters." Harper considered that, feeling the weight of it settle in her in a good way. "I like that," she said. "It takes the pressure off. It's why I take these trips," Elias said, "not just to rest, but to remind myself there are still parts of me I haven't met yet." The words sat between them for a while, neither needing to be dressed up or qualified. The lanterns flickered slightly. As a breeze moved through the porch, Harper adjusted the blanket over her knees, and Elias shifted his arm just enough that it brushed hers. The contact was light, but it carried a quiet certainty, neither accidental nor hurried. "You're easy to talk to," she said. He smiled, but didn't look away from the river. "So, are you?" They sat like that for a long while, watching. The rain blurred the far bank into soft shapes. The conversation moved in and out of pauses, touching on books they'd loved, places they still wanted to see, the strange comfort of old photographs. There was no sense of trying to impress each other, only the shared pleasure of being known in small increments. When Harper finally stood to head inside, she found herself reluctant to let the moment close. Elias seemed to feel it too, because he rose at the same time, walking her to the door, even though his chair was closer to the river. "Good night," she said, pausing on the threshold. "Good night, Harper." His voice was warm enough to carry her up the stairs. In her room, the rain's soft percussion was still audible through the window. Harper slipped under the quilt, the conversation replaying in her mind not for what was said, but for how it felt. She realized she didn't just like talking to Elias. She liked being herself while talking to him. No adjustments, no edits. She closed her eyes with the faintest smile. The sound of the river and the rain blending into a lullaby that seemed written just for her. The trail, with no hurry morning, came with a sky so clear it seemed to have washed itself overnight. The rain had rinsed the air to a crisp brightness. Every leaf in the orchard looked newly polished. Harper woke earlier than usual, drawn by a sense that the day wanted to be noticed. She dressed in soft layers and went down to the dining room, where May was already placing fresh scones beside the coffee urn. "You're up before the coffees even had time to wake," May teased gently. "I think the weather pulled me out of bed," Harper said. May poured her a cup and slid a small jar of blackberry jam across the counter. "Today's a trail day," she said. "The ridge path will give you a view worth carrying home." Elias appeared in the doorway, hair still damp from a shower, a folded map in his hand. "Guess what May just told me," he said, holding the map like a clue. "That the ridge path is worth the climb," Harper asked. "Exactly," he said, grinning. "I was going to ask if you wanted to see it." "Of course," she said without hesitation. The ridge path began just beyond the orchard, a narrow dirt trail that wove upward through tall pines. The air under the trees was cooler, layered with the scent of resin and last night's rain. They moved at an easy pace, neither trying to prove anything, stopping now and then to listen to a woodpecker tapping somewhere high above or to watch a pair of squirrels chase each other across the branches. Halfway up, the path curved sharply. Along a slope, a patch of damp leaves had loosened in the rain, turning the ground underfoot into a slick mat. Harper stepped onto it and felt her footing slip. Before she could react, Ilias's hand was at her elbow, steadying her. The grip was firm, warm, but not panicked just enough to make her feel anchored, he asked, his voice low but carrying an undercurrent of genuine concern. She exhaled a small laugh. "The kind you give when your heart has skipped for more than one reason. I'm fine, just forgot to respect the laws of gravity." For a second, his hand stayed at her elbow for a breath longer than necessary before he let go, his eyes still scanning the trail ahead as if it might try something else. They walked on, and Harper found herself more aware of the space between them, how it seemed to narrow and widen, not with the trail, but with the unspoken rhythm of their connection. At the ridge's crest, the view opened like a book to its most vivid illustration. The river, far below, curved in a wide arc, the sunlight turning it into a moving ribbon of light. Fields spread out in patchwork greens and golds, and beyond them, the faint shimmer of the coast hinted at the ocean. "Worth carrying home?" Elias asked, echoing May's words. Harper nodded, her eyes sweeping the horizon. "More than worth it." They found a flat rock and sat side by side, letting the views settle into them. Elias unfolded a small thermos from his pack and poured coffee into 2 enamel cups. "May's idea," he said. "She said the view would need something to hold on to." Harper took her cup, feeling the warmth seep into her hands. "She's good at knowing what a moment needs." Elias glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. "Sometimes I think she runs this place less like an inn and more like a quiet kind of matchmaking service. Not just for people for moments. For the right conversation at the right time." Harper smiled. "If that's what she's doing, she's very good at it." They drank in silence for a while, the wind threading through the pines above. Then Harper said, almost without thinking, "You didn't even hesitate when I slipped back there." Elias turned his head toward her. "Why would I?" "I don't know," she said softly. "It just felt like you knew exactly what to do." His gaze held hers. "Steady sometimes," he said. "You don't think about the right thing to do. You just do it because the idea of not doing it isn't an option." The words landed in her like a stone in still water rippling outward, touching places she didn't know were waiting. On the way back down, they took a slower pace, more aware of the trail's small tricks. When they reached the slippery bend again, Elias stepped ahead and offered his hand without ceremony. Harper took it, her fingers closing around his with a kind of quiet certainty she hadn't expected to feel. They stayed connected until the path leveled out, neither rushing to let go. By the time they returned to the inn, the sun was high and the porch was filling with guests enjoying lemonade and slices of fresh peach pie. May caught sight of them and raised an eyebrow in that way she had half welcome, half knowing question. "Ridge path?" she asked. "And back again," Elias said. Harper smiled, the warmth of his hand still lingering in her own. "Definitely. Worth carrying home." Lantern light and unfinished sentences, the day's warmth lingered into evening, settling over the inn like a comfortable quilt. Dinner had been one of May's long table affairs, platters of roast vegetables, bowls of herbed potatoes, a centerpiece of wildflowers gathered from the clearing. Guests lingered long after the plates were cleared, some on the porch, others in the parlor where a low game of chess was unfolding. Harper drifted toward the porch, drawn by the gentle spill of lantern light over the steps. She carried a glass of chilled white wine, condensation tracing lazy paths down the stem. The air smelled faintly of basil from the herb pots lining the railing. Beyond, the river moved in its patient, moonlit rhythm. Elias was already there, leaning against the railing at the far end. He wore a light shirt, sleeves rolled, the collar open just enough to make him look both at ease and quietly attentive. His posture was unhurried, but there was a kind of alertness in the way his eyes followed the movement of the lantern flames. When she joined him, he didn't shift or make room, he just let the space between them adjust naturally, close enough for their shoulders to almost align. "Good evening," he said, his voice low enough to be carried only to her. "Evening," Harper replied. She took a sip of her wine, the coolness playing against the warm air. "The ridge path was a good call, I'm glad you thought so." His glance met hers briefly, and something unspoken passed through. It's something that felt like a shared replay of that moment on the trail, when his hand had steadied hers. Ever the quiet orchestrator appeared with a small tray of short cookies, setting them on the porch table without comment. She gave them both a look that was part smile, part permission. Before retreating back inside, Elias reached for a cookie, broke it in half, and handed her one piece without asking. She took it, their fingers brushing in the exchange of fleeting contact, but waited with the memory of their earlier connection. The porch filled gradually as the other guests wandered out. Someone lit a cluster of lanterns at the center table, their golden light pooling over the wood. The conversations around them were low, private. No one seemed to need to speak above the hum of the night. Elias leaned slightly toward her. "Do you ever think about the things you don't say out loud?" Harper tilted her head. "All the time. Sometimes I think the unsaid things make more of a conversation than the words." He considered that. "And sometimes, the unsaid things feel like they're just waiting for the right kind of night. This might be one of those nights," she said before she could stop herself. His smile was small, almost inward. "Maybe so." A light breeze moved through, carrying the faint scent of the river and stirring the lantern flames. Somewhere, down by the water, a frog began its steady, rhythmic call. The sound was almost hypnotic, matching the slow sway of the rocking chairs. Elias glanced toward the steps. "Walk with me?" Harper nodded, setting her glass on the railing. They descended the porch into the soft grass, the lantern light trailing after them for a few steps. Before giving way to the silver wash of moonlight, they followed the short path to the riverbank. The water was calm tonight, catching the stars in small, fractured reflections. Harper stopped near the edge, folding her arms loosely as she looked out. "I keep thinking about that moment on the trail," she said quietly. Elias stepped closer, not crowding her, but closing the space enough that she could feel his presence. "So do I." She turned her head toward him. "It wasn't just about not falling." "I know," he said, his tone steady but carrying something deeper. "Some things aren't about what they look like, they're about what they mean." They stood there, the air between them charged but not rushed. The river whispered against the bank, and the occasional creak of the inn's porch drifted down the hill. Elias reached into his pocket and pulled out something smaller, flat stone, its surface smooth and pale. "Picked this up on the way back from the ridge," he said. "It reminded me of the ones you were trying to skip." Harper took it from him, her thumb tracing its cool surface. "I'll keep it," she said, "not as a trophy, more like a marker." "A marker for what?" She thought for a moment. "For the place where something shifted, even if I don't have the right words for it yet." Elias's eyes held hers, steady and unblinking for a beat longer than comfort usually allowed. Then he nodded, as if accepting an agreement they hadn't spoken aloud. On the walk back to the porch, their hands brushed once, twice. On the third time, neither moved away. Their fingers linked in a loose, easy clasping knot, a claim. Not an announcement, but a quiet acknowledgement. The kind of gesture that said, "I'm here, and I want you to know it." When they reached the steps, Harper expected they would let go, but they didn't. They climbed, the few boards still connected, their joined hands hidden in the fold of the blanket draped over her arm. May glanced up from her seat near the railing, her smile subtle but knowing. She didn't comment, only offered them each a fresh cup of tea. They sat in the far corner again, the night deepening around them. Their conversation meandered books they'd half finished, places they still wanted to see, the strange comfort of hearing rain at night, and yet, beneath each sentence, there was a current neither of them named. At one point, Elias began a thought, then stopped. "You know," he said, "there's something I broke off." Looking down at his tea, as if the words needed more time. Harper waited, not pushing. "When you're ready," she said softly. He looked up, meeting her eyes again. "Maybe, soon." And that was enough. Later, when Harper climbed the stairs to room 3, the smooth stone was still in her pocket, warm now from her hand. She set it on the nightstand beside her bed, the lantern light catching its faint gray veins. It looked ordinary, but it held the weight of an unfinished sentence, in the quiet certainty that some sentences are best left to find their own endings. The river moved steadily outside, keeping its own counsel. The morning the river spoke, dawn came with a sky so pale it looked almost translucent, like the day had been washed in milk before it was handed over to the sun. Harper woke before her alarm, not with the grogginess of being pulled from sleep too soon, but with the quiet readiness of someone whose mind had already been walking ahead without her. She sat up, the quilt pooling in her lap, and looked toward the window. The river was a soft pewter ribbon, stitched at the edges by the faintest threads of mist. Somewhere down its bend, a heron might already be standing in the shallows, the same way it had on her first morning here. She felt the thought like a touch on her shoulder. This was her last day at the slow river inn. The realization wasn't heavy, it was a bittersweet weight, like the last piece of pie you save, knowing you can only taste it once. She dressed without rushing, pulling on a soft sweater and the jeans she'd worn on the ridge hike, the ones that still held the faint dust from the trail. Before leaving the room, she glanced at the small stone Elias had given her. It sat on the nightstand like a witness, cool and unassuming, but charged with the quiet electricity of every moment they'd shared since. She slipped it into her pocket. Downstairs, May was arranging fresh muffins on a wide ceramic plate, their top split just enough to show the dark berries inside. "You're early," May said, glancing up with that warm, perceptive gaze that seemed to read more than your face. "Couldn't sleep in," Harper replied. "Didn't want to miss anything." "Good instinct," May said. She poured Harper a cup of coffee and, after a brief pause, added, "If you wander down to the bend this morning, you might just find it has something to say." Harper smiled faintly. "Do you always speak in riddles?" May grinned. "Only, when they're true." The morning air was brisk but not biting. Harper followed the path past the orchard, the grass still jeweled with dew. Each step felt both familiar and new, as if the trail were quietly adjusting itself for the occasion. She didn't see Elias until she rounded the last curve before the bend. He was standing at the water's edge, hands in his pockets, his posture relaxed in the way of someone who's been waiting not impatiently, but with a certainty that the right thing will arrive when it's meant to. "Morning," he said, his voice carrying easily over the hush of the river. "Morning," she replied, stopping beside him. For a few breaths, they simply stood together, watching the water. The heron was there, poised on one leg, its neck curved in that patient arc she'd come to think of as a kind of prayer. The scene felt like the perfect echo of her first day. Here, except now, there was Elias beside her, his presence as much a part of the landscape as the mist and the slow current. "I was hoping you'd come," he said quietly. "I think May made sure of that," Harper replied with a small smile. Elias looked at her then, fully, and she felt the focus of it in her chest. "I don't know how to say this neatly," he began, "and I'm not sure I want to. Neat makes it feel like something you file away. This isn't that." Her breath caught a little, but she didn't speak. "These past days," he continued, "I've realized something about the kind of spaces I want in my life. They're not the loud ones. They're not about chasing or proving. They're this." He gestured to the river, the trees, the mist curling around the bend. "Quiet, but not empty. Alive in ways you only notice if you stay long enough." She felt her throat tighten, not with sadness, but with recognition. "And you think this us belongs in that kind of space?" "I do," he said. "I think it might be the truest part of it." The heron took flight then, its wings opening in a slow, powerful sweep. They watched it rise above the water, circle once, and disappear beyond the trees. Harper let the moment breathe before speaking. "I wasn't looking for this when I stopped here," she admitted. "I thought I was just resting, catching my breath before going back to the life I'd built. But now, I'm not sure I want to go back to it the same way." Elias's gaze softened. "Maybe you don't have to." She laughed quietly. "It's not that simple." "No," he agreed, "but it's not impossible either." They began walking back along the path, slower than they needed to, as if each step postponed the moment they'd have to leave this stretch of river behind. About halfway, Elias stopped and turned toward her. "I've been carrying something around," he said, reaching into his jacket. He pulled out an envelope, unsealed, its edges slightly worn as if it had been handled more than once. "I was going to put it in May's ledger box, but I think it should go to you now." Harper took it, her fingers brushing his. Inside was a single piece of paper, folded once. She opened it and saw his handwriting steady, a little slanted. "Some places feel like they're waiting for you. Some people, too." Her eyes lingered on the words, the simplicity of them, the way they seemed to hold more than they said. They reached the inn just as the sun broke fully over the ridge, casting the porch in warm gold. May was there, as if she'd been expecting them, 2 mugs of coffee already set on the railing. She didn't say anything, just offered a knowing smile before slipping back inside. Harper and Elias sat at the far end of the porch, the same corner where so many of their evenings had unfolded. "What happens now?" she asked, not as a demand, but as a genuine wondering. He thought for a moment. "Now, we don't rush. We don't try to make this into something it isn't ready to be. We just keep walking the same trail, even if it changes scenery." She nodded slowly, feeling the truth of it settle into her like a stone. Finding the riverbed. They spent the rest of the morning Together, without a plan helping, May arranged flowers for the lunch tables, taking a slow stroll through the orchard. Sitting in the parlor, while a guest played the piano softly in the background, it was the kind of day that asked for nothing but presents. When the afternoon came, Harper packed her bag in room 3. She moved slowly, folding each piece of clothing with care, her fingers brushing the quilt one last time. She placed the small stone from Elias on top of her things, not buried but visible. Like a compass point. Elias was waiting by her car when she came down. They didn't speak right away. Instead, they stood together in the kind of silence that feels like an embrace without touch. Finally, he said, "You'll come back." She smiled. "You'll still be here." "Always," he said, and she believed him.